Very welcome to our very final event of the series, Stories from the Future. It was an adventure and an experiment that we conducted together over the past 8 months. We started the workshop Stories from the Future in early June 2020 as a completely on a program that was completely run online, and we had the big pleasure to have many different nationalities and people with very different backgrounds coming together to think about our collective future. I think by now probably I don't have to introduce myself too much. Just quickly, my name is Daniela. I'm part of the curatorial team, the Akut Macht Neu, and the Collective Practices program. And I invited Lisa and Dylan to moderate and facilitate this amazing workshop and experience. And I'm extremely happy with what we will be able to see today. This will be the exhibition launch of the artifacts that the people developed in the over the course of the workshop, thinking about the future and thinking also from a perspective from the future, looking back at our time now. And before handing over to Lisa and Dylan to introduce us further into today's program, I just wanted to say thank you again to HKF, who made this possible with the funding, and a big thank you also to my colleague Olga Wiedemann, who helped incredibly to make all this work and make it possible, and to all the participants to put in so much work and effort and energy and fantasy and creativity. It's really amazing what came out. And without further ado, I hand over to Lisa and Dylan.
Thank you, Daniela. And thank you, Daniela and Olga, for all of your support for the last 8 months. This has really, I remember when I was pitching this idea back in March, February, before the lockdowns began, that Daniela, you said this was going to be a big program and maybe the biggest that Collective Practices would have. And I think it ended up being even bigger than that in terms of at least what I expected. So thank you for sticking with us the whole time. And I think that what we have to show today really shows that all the time that we spent together was well spent. But so far, I've been just kind of monologuing as if everybody knows what I'm talking about. So maybe just a few sentences about Stories from the Future, this project that we've spent the last 8 months together working on. It was envisioned as a workshop series, so with 4 public workshops and internal workshops between there, where about 20 participants would come together and imagine a climate neutral 2030 and imagine, okay, what does that look like? And what's special about this 2030 that we want to capture somehow in an artifact and bring back to 2021 to share. And so that's what we spent the last 8 months working on. And it's definitely none of the artifacts are things I could have imagined ahead of time. So kudos to everybody for that. And I think that the teams that we've got together, the collaborations, but also the individual projects really show the range of work, the range of ideas and wavelengths that we're working on. And yeah, they give me a lot of hope moving into 2021, where we're still in lockdown here in Berlin, that maybe we can move into these positive directions anyway. And Dylan's going to introduce us to what we're doing today, which is our final meeting together, our final workshop and our final exhibition.
Right, yeah. So, hi, Dylan. Today, as Lisa mentioned, this is the 4th and final workshop of the workshop series so far. So again, we've been working together for 8 months. I think we had our first meeting, our public meeting back in June. And all these are, of course, on Akut TV or on the Collective Practices website somewhere. So of course, check those out. But again, this is our 4th one that we're having together publicly to share with folks. And it's been, again, as Daniela mentioned, such a journey in figuring out, what counts as a story, what counts as an artifact, what are we doing, sort of taking this idea of the future 10 years from now and doing our best to come up with some story or timeline or artifact to bring back to the present has been really interesting. And it's been a really rewarding and generative experience for me as someone who I guess studies storytelling in a lot of ways. So with that being said, today's our final exhibition. We're going to be presenting the artifacts folks have been working on for the past 8 months. We have a pretty packed lineup, so stick around. Folks will be presenting in about 10-minute chunks or so. So, and Lisa and I will take turns sort of introducing those projects or artifacts. But before we get there, I do just want to let you all know that the sort of stage here is that we're in 2021 presenting these artifacts from the future. So if you could all collectively imagine with us that these artifacts have come from 2030 and they're being discussed in the present, right? So that's the framework we're all sort of working in at the moment. And folks had a few questions to consider with regards to how they're talking about these, though of course they didn't necessarily have to stick to these questions, but just for listeners and viewers, if you're interested in sort of what's going on behind the scenes at the moment, these are the few questions we had folks consider. Given the prompt, bringing back an artifact from 2030, what was your creative or thought process for creating the artifact that you did? The second question is, when we began this workshop, we did so with the explicit goal of carbon neutrality by 2030 in mind. Does that factor into your final artifact? If so, how? And if not, that's totally okay, because that has been a prompt, but not something necessarily folks have stuck to explicitly. What do you hope that folks take away or learn from your artifacts? And then finally, how and why did you choose the specific format that you did for your artifact? So as a podcast or video collage, etc. So yeah, that's where we're working with today. And it seems like I'm the first one to go. So I don't know if Lisa wants to introduce me or if I should just slide into that myself.
Well, I guess I can introduce of why I wanted you to go first, Dylan,
Okay,
which is
sure.
that your artifact, so Dylan, during this process, got a professorship in Colorado to continue his professional work and his research work of thinking about stories and thinking about storytelling in the context of climate change. So his artifact is he's imagined, okay, now he's maybe a professor with tenure, we're hoping, 10 years from now, what has he learned and what has our project taught about this? So I thought this would be a really great way to kind of segue into the speculation exercise, because he's got an artifact that really helps us at the meta level. So Dylan, I can't wait to hear more.
Sure. All right, well, I'm gonna go first. For this presentation, I tried to not necessarily repeat what is on the website. Of course, I'll mention that. And I guess we forgot to mention that there's a website where you can see all of these things eventually, right? Where they're uploaded at the moment, we're going to publish the website, and it's kind of our online archive of our artifacts. But in any case, for this presentation, I'm going to try to do, and keep it to 10 minutes, more of kind of an experimental approach to thinking about storytelling in the abstract. So we'll see if my screen shares. And there's 4 small parts to this presentation. So multiple participants can share, advanced screen share, okay. Advanced, background content. The screen share is really funny here, huh? Advanced. Well, I get a whiteboard, hold shift to select multiple windows. I don't see the normal screen share option, and I know I should have practiced this beforehand. I see a whiteboard and universal something. Doesn't matter. The presentation's not that, the PowerPoint's not a big deal. So I'll just kind of talk here. So in any case, for the first part, I want to introduce you all to this concept by John Keats, a poet, called negative capabilities. And perhaps you've heard of this concept before. But basically, as a poet, he mentions, and he's writing this in a letter to one of his friends, this idea that the true mark of a genius is someone who can hold 2 opposing viewpoints in their minds without resolving them. So another way to think about this is you can have, I believe in climate change. I think climate change is a hoax. And rather than trying to resolve that all the time, to sit with uncomfortability and to sit with the ambiguity of both of those viewpoints And I think that the role of the storyteller in a lot of ways is to toe the line between those perceptions and to communicate that effectively, right? So I think storytelling in a lot of ways is meant to help us think, not necessarily about ambiguity, but not necessarily about facts as such, right? There's ways to communicate truths without communicating fact, right? Through storytelling. And so I think this idea of a negative capabilities approach, again, holding two things in tension, explaining and exploring that tension, I think is a really good and powerful role of storytelling, especially with regards to the future, which is something that, of course, we all want to resolve for ourselves. We all want to think about the future in a certain way. Perhaps you want to be there, for example. But rather than doing that, right, I think storytelling helps us speculate in a really meaningful way. And so on that note, I want to read just a quick little piece that I wrote for our zine. So some of you who are listening perhaps may not get a chance to see the zine. We've collectively created sort of a written artifact as well, and some of us have created artifacts for that as well. And I just want to read really quickly what I wrote for the zine as a way of setting up my artifact. So I will read this, and maybe you can imagine a pretty image on the Zoom at the moment. When we came together in 2020, there were multiple competing and nested crises happening around us. For starters, there was a global pandemic, a once-in-a-century event, though these days, I know not to take too much stock in anything happening once in a century. We were all told to stay home, to not see others in order to stay safe, but we still found ways to connect through what now feels like arcane technology, Zoom, email, texting. The tech worked, it did the job, but it certainly didn't make it easy, especially considering that our entire society existed on these platforms. We learned on Zoom, we worked on Zoom, we recreated on Zoom. We had to relearn what storytelling was and what it meant. In addition to the global pandemic, there was a global reckoning with racial capitalism, with much of this reckoning taking place in the former United States. Though the impacts of this reckoning could be felt deeply across the globe, we struggled to think about the future then. Who would live there? Who gets to imagine it? Who gets to tell stories about it? Specifically, who were we to decide answers to these questions? With these questions in mind, however, we wanted to lean into the reckoning. Additionally, burning beneath our feet was the changing climate. Where I lived then, in the western part of the former United States, was literally on fire for months. And still, despite these literal and figurative fires, people were still dismissive of the changing climate. People, or at least some people, had the privilege to be ignorant then. We wanted to tell stories about a future that was free of ignorance. Finally, there was profound loneliness and isolation. We all had to learn to be together while not being near one another. The loneliness hurt us the most, but stories helped us then, as they always have and always will. Our time together was beautiful. It was respite from the crises. We all began with an intuitive understanding of storytelling in mind. Everyone can tell a story. Storytelling is about meaning making, sense making. We were trying to make sense of the moment while speculating about the future. We wanted to build artifacts about the future and bring them back. But I realized that the process itself of living through unprecedented times to make stories about an unknown future was an artifact itself, a testament to the need for meaning making. The world is still very much in flux. There has been significant progress since 2020. The world is entirely carbon neutral now, though this was not necessarily a result of altruism or goodwill, mostly survival. Once we stopped using fossil fuels, there was a bump in global temperatures, something that modelers knew would happen. This bump resulted in mass migrations, more than there already were at the time. There was so much migration that the entire idea of a nation state was thrown out. There are now no borders, but there's still territory. We're mucking our way through returning it back to the people who had it in the first place. Inequality persists, of course, so we continue to tell stories. Now, 10 years later, in 2030, the world is still unprecedented, but in the words of Octavia Butler, God has changed. Stories make sense of change, and stories are our prayers. So again, this is what I wrote for the zine. Again, thinking about the future, thinking about the process mostly of writing, it has been in large part my artifact. And so just finally wrapping up here, thinking about my artifact specifically, on the website, you'll see me recording a video from the top of a mountain nearby where I live. And I talk about sort of 10 years out from now, the impact of this workshop across the board, not just the sort of work we did collectively, but how it matched and meshed into the work that was happening around us as well. So there's been sort of a resurgence in storytelling and the need for it in the past decade or so. And our project is sort of ending at a time when that's really taken up. And so I couched this in the conversation that was happening when I recorded the video, which was in the United States, at least, when there was a so-called insurrection on the Capitol. And I think what that really does is put into perspective that there are multiple competing nested crises. And along with those crises, there's multiple competing and nested stories. And again, I think about the present as a time where stories are incredibly important. I think that it's how we make sense of one another. And I look forward to seeing how this group's work continues to grow past this. And as a sort of end note to my presentation, the final artifact I'm working on is actually writing about this process in the context of these larger sort of cultural moments. Of course, that's going to take some time, but stay tuned. And with that, I will stop my presentation. So feel free to, again, check out my artifact on the website. But yeah, that's sort of my presentation for my work so far. Sorry my PowerPoint didn't work or that I didn't practice it, but it was really just some kind of spinning pretty images. So if you can just use your imagination. So yeah, with that being said, I'm going to introduce our next presenter, Lynn Ford, who's going to tell us about plants from the future.
Lynn, you're still muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Is that better?
That's perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was so worried about getting my share screen up, I forgot to unmute. These days, I try to start every morning with more than just the deep breath and good morning that I say. I use a quotation from Maya Angelou as a mantra. She said, "This is a wonderful day. I have never seen this one before." And that kind of translates into my choice of artifacts, the art being photographs, not bringing the plants back from the future, but the images of them. That's the way I feel about picking plants. I'd rather take a picture. I'm not a professional photographer at all, but I'd rather carry the picture in my mind or in my phone than touch the plant and change the environment. So the first picture that I shared, I call I call Sweet Life. This is a picture of a honeysuckle in Arizona. And the caption that I used for the image was dry air and dry soil, yet the honeysuckle thrived. Its seeds as red as life's blood, its blooms as bright as sunfire. Because it refused to die, the butterflies returned to rediscover the sweetness of life. Native honeysuckle is non-invasive. If you grow what was meant to be there, the environment can thrive. If you take the plants from someplace else, just because they smell wonderful and look very pretty, and plant them, they may invade your natural environment and cause great damage. And that's the same thing that we do in many ways with the way we live, invading what is already effectively working in nature and in relationship, and not considering the outcomes of that. This honeysuckle was growing where it was meant to grow, dry soil, stony soil, a native honeysuckle plant. It had no real scent, and yet the butterflies love these plants as well as hummingbirds. And so I thought, having that alive and well in 2030 and bringing back that image to show that it thrived, thus the butterflies and hummingbirds thrived, would be an important incentive to people in this year, well, last year, to consider what they're planting, how they're growing things, what they're picking, how they're changing the environment. The other image, and I hope I have it here, is one that I took, let's see, right outside my front door. The caption for it is "Holly in Snow." It was growing outside my front door, and so I don't know if the people who lived here before knew that this was a lightning plant. It was planted in the old days by people of Celtic and Norse heritage to protect their homes from lightning. We've never been struck by lightning, so I don't know if it works or not, but the plant was growing beside our front door. And in one of the worst snowstorms that we had, there in all the white that was burying everything else, I could see these red berries like little drops of blood. And so my caption for it is, the time traveler returned with a story of a plant thriving in snow. Its berries fed birds. Its leaves offered herbal remedies. It was cherished, growing wild, called by its ancient name. The sun never forgot. That's the translation of the old name for holly. It represents peace and goodwill these days, something that we all need. And it's very poisonous. However, if you know how to use it properly, it's good for coughs and fevers and as a heart stimulant. And to me, that was important because we need to find more, just as neighbors in this world, find out more about biodiversity and water resources and how the plants, from trees down to the tiniest flowers, are a part of our ways to combat climate change. I wrote down a little note for myself. It says, it's vital that we understand the purpose and place in the cycle of life and protect even the smallest of the flowers. The world needs their beauty, yes, but even more, the world needs to understand their nourishing and healing properties for the diversity and balance of all life. We need them to survive. So those are my artifacts, those photographs. I take a lot of pictures of plants and green places and mountains, more so than people. And I carry them home with me, but I also carry them in my heart. And I guess that does fit into the concepts of carbon neutrality by 2030. And I hope that folks gain from this a little bit of thought and reflection on what's growing in their yards, around their homes, how all that lovely green grass does absolutely nothing as far as feeding your family or helping your environment. It just looks pretty, and pretty isn't necessarily beautiful for the world. So I think that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That was very beautiful. And I'm going to share, because both you and Dylan have shared with us already artifacts from the zine. I wanted to just share the cover of the zine for anyone who's listening or watching. You can go to the website collectivepractices.akutmachtneu.de, yes, and download the zine. We have a special version that is available for download and printing at home to make sure that it works on home printers as well. But it has a lot of really great artifacts, many of which we're showing today, and also ones that are extra just for the zine. Next, we have one of two larger groups of what we just saw were 2 individual artifacts, and now we have several people who work together to create multiple artifacts in a collectively imagined 2030. They work under the name Faces and Places. And what's interesting is we have some geographers, so there's a lot of maps, also some journals, but I don't want to steal the floor from you. So Robin, Jana, and Lavinia, take it away.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So I only have a couple of snapshots of what we've done. Anna is going to follow up and tell a little bit more about her particular work. So the question of how carbon neutrality is central to our work, I think is absolutely a yes. When we first started, we kind of started with this idea of the compost communities, which is a Donna Haraway creation, as a strong guiding concept for what we were doing. It's this idea that it's an idea of a post-human world in which genetic alteration is possible to create more than humans. And these more than humans, they follow, study, and help heal different species on the planet. So for example, you could have some butterfly genetics put into you as a child, or as a fetus, I guess, and then you can actually turn into sort of a butterfly type human that works with butterflies on the planet. So this issue of carbon neutrality is absolutely central to our universe. It's explicit in the names of our respective communities and the processes that drive our characters. So our group took this compost community idea and expanded on it, each of us creating a new facet of a new post-carbon world. So we used a number of terms and concepts that are outlined really nicely in Jana's sort of larger PDF that's on our website. So if some of these things don't kind of click immediately, it's kind of on purpose. I want you guys to go and read her work, especially, and take a look at all the other Faces and Places people or artifacts that we created. So we each started, I think, in a place that was comfortable to us. Jana began really writing out a lot of the sort of descriptive communities and characters that were taking place in our universe. Lavinia began creating these beautiful collages. And as we all know, pictures worth 1,000 words. And so these collages just really struck a chord, like an emotional chord. And I'll let her, defer to her to explain those further. Amelie explored carbon burial, like a carbon burial ritual, as sort of an initiation to a community that's committed to a low carbon lifestyle. So where a carbon burial is kind of a ritual for burying one's own legacy to carbon emissions. So the ritual could be place-based, or it could be kind of virtually based, constituted by a media network maybe. The concept was pretty broad. Lisa popped in and offered not only sage advice, but also this concept of an Earthseed community, where we're all helping each other. Sort of community and help work is central to that community. And then, as I said, Jana created this intricate, character-driven picture of Brandenburg in 2030. So this is a colloquistopian community. And again, I won't define it because I want you guys to go read it. But essentially, it's where people were brought together from a variety of communities to create a network of regional solidarity that provides the, quote, good life for all. So infinity communities, Earthseed communities, compost communities, all of these came together in cities and villages. And the process is what's really interesting about her work. So you sort of see all of these communities and people working together to create something bigger than themselves. And then finally, I'm a geographer, so I like to work in maps, and I created a map of New America, which in sort of Tolkien-esque tradition is just the beginning of a character-driven story about America after a brief civil war in 2021, and after the boundaries of America are redrawn, where all of these sort of types of communities are now drawing new territories and existing on their own. So all of these life stories and descriptions and new communities, we call ourselves the Faces and Places group. Faces because we're looking at the individual, and places because we're looking at these communal levels of organization and how we actually get to a carbon neutral future. The question of why we chose our artifacts, I think we all work in sort of distinctive ways. But I think what's really special about our group, and I think the thing that we, as talking as a group, wanted to make sure in this particular meeting we talk about, is that each one of our contributions really inspired all the other group members to kind of try to echo that effort and do the same. So, you know, Jana started writing in this amazingly descriptive and specific way. And then I think Lavinia and Lisa and I were all just really inspired to do the same. I made a map, and then Lavinia and Jana started making maps. So I think what it was like, if you guys are all familiar with the improv world, it was like a giant game of yes and, where we all just said, yes, let's do that, and let's do this other thing and this other thing. And so we sort of created, I felt like, a really rich, universe in the multiverse that was the larger Collective Practices project, which was really fun. And I never really participated in something like this that was, you know, outside of improv. So it was a very fun process. The biggest question, or something that we really want people to take away, and, you know, Jana, Lavinia, please add to this. You know, I think when we first started, we wanted to get at the question of, well, how do we get there? You know, we were kind of thinking on global terms. And then as we got into the projects, they began to be more and more specific and place-based, because we were familiar with those places, right? Italy, Germany, and the United States. And so I think what we'd really like everyone to take away is this feeling, a picture, an imaginary of how we can actually get to a carbon neutral society. So, you know, in the vein of improv, if we all just sort of say yes, and then add our own spin on it, or our own little creation, I think that's the trick, and that's the key. A lot of times, especially in the United States right now, we all like to say no to things. And I think what was really fascinating about the process itself was how we all just said yes, and how great and creative that can actually be. So I did want to share, before I hand it over to Lavinia, it is interesting. It's very different. I wonder what this is. So the whiteboard thing, Dylan, I totally agree. So this is the map of the new America, just as an example of one of our artifacts. As you can see, America is now divided into sort of 3 separate sovereign nations: Pacifica, Liberty, and Atlanta. And we have all of these little communities kind of claiming territory within those larger country boundaries. So this was just, you know, sort of the jumping off point for a larger project. And I think it's an interesting approach. I don't know, sort of in the geographic world, it's an interesting approach to sort of start with the place and then move on to the stories. And then again, just a final plug for reading the Colloicostopia Brandenburg 2030. It's a beautifully written and wonderfully illustrated story of creating a carbon neutral society. So with that, I will hand it over to Lavinia, or to Hanu. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. I'm actually a bit moved by, from what you said. I think there's little to add to the great introduction you provided for our group. And I especially love the yes and metaphor, I also felt that we were working just like that, just rebounding, and it was like playing ping pong, really. The ball going from one side to the next, and it was really inspiring. And what I loved also, as you said, is the reconnection of the global with the local. So for me, what really inspired me in my own creative process was realizing at some point that what we were imagining was already happening around me. So the letter I wrote to Fallon, one of my artifacts, as well as my map, the map I produced, is what I wanted to build is really a bridge between my present and not my own. I mean, not just my own, and our future. And these things are happening already. Maybe we don't have the technology to produce butterfly babies or like Camille 1 and 2 and 3, but there are changes happening out there and around you as well. There are people experimenting with different lifestyles, with actual very concrete goals for how to achieve carbon neutrality, how to include different perspectives in how we're living. And I think this is what has really inspired me most for my future and in my work as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. Is that the Faces and Places groups? Okay, perfect. Thank you all so much for that. We're moving on to Franziska, who's going to tell us about museum tickets from the future. And again, just to reiterate a bit here, we have, again, several types of artifacts, right? Types of stories. And this is another example of that. So, and I guess I should note too that, you know, we do have these sort of individual projects, we have these group projects that Lisa mentioned, but then we also have, we have had folks who have interacted with one another through these different processes who aren't necessarily in the title of, you know, the group per se. So I just want to say all this because Franziska's been involved in almost every story that we're presenting in some capacity, and also created these museum tickets. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Franziska.
Thank you, Dylan. And I don't think I've been involved in every single one, but just in a few of them. So what I created on my own is the museum tickets and flyers and postcards that you can see behind me. There's a total of 5 of them. And if you go to the website or the zine, you can look at them more closely, as you may not see them in full detail behind me. I thought of museum tickets, and they're not museum tickets from museums you can go in 2030, because it always takes a while until things go into a museum. So it's more like museums you could go visit in 2050-ish or a bit before. And I thought museum tickets would be a good artifact to bring back, because we know that 2018 to 2030 will be probably the most important time in human history. Whether or not we can tackle this climate change problem we're having or not is going to define the futures of generations to come. So if we are really now living in one of the most important times of human history, or the most important one, then that will be reflected heavily in museums in the future. It has to. So everything we do now, and also everything we don't do now, will be shown in museums. All but one of my artifacts fit into a carbon neutral world. The black one you see up here is a museum ticket to a museum that shows how Switzerland was investing into fossil fuels until 2034. I included this negative future to show that if we are inactive and we are not going towards the transition, that will also have an impact and that people will talk about this in the future. And also because I'm from Switzerland and I'm actually outraged that our financial system, our pension funds, our national banks, our banks, they actually, with their investments, emit 20 or 22 times as much carbon as we emit as a country ourselves. And there's no regulations given from politics, or the banks themselves are moving really slow to change that. And that really makes me furious, because investment should be made into the future and not into the past. I wanted to show things that will, things that we have now that won't exist in the future. So there's museums like the Combustion Engine Museum, showing that some of the stuff we have now will disappear completely with the transition we have. I also wanted to show positive outcomes of transitioning, because I think for a lot of people, they don't want to transition because they think they have to, they have to give up stuff. But with this one over here, you can see how we will get cleaner air. And down here, you can see how there will be more creative spaces, because we will use the space made up for example, gas stations for creative spaces. Also wanted to show projects that are already ongoing. So I have a flyer for a museum that shows the Race to Zero, which is an ongoing initiative worldwide for cities, countries, companies to say, yes, we are racing to zero. And I also wanted to show the Freie Internationale Tankstelle, which is an already ongoing project which turns gas station into creative hubs when they're not used anymore. So with this, I kind of wanted to connect what we have now to the future and show how the future could look like through museums. Yes.
Perfect, thank you. And just another sort of plug to our website. Again, you can go and see these in more depth, right? So these presentations, you can sort of see these floating around Franziska's head as we do in Zoom. But if you want to look closer, sort of read more about them, by all means, check out the website. So thank you so much for that. Next up, we have a group who has been working on changing their mascot for their high school, I believe. So I don't want to give too much away, but we have Lisa and Alessandro who are going to talk about their process of that whole process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over with Lisa.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Yeah, very, very subtly, deftly introduced. So I was very excited when we started this process to have Alessandra here as one of the participants, as she and I went to high school together. And as I was thinking about what kind of artifact I would want to work on, especially with the influx of new ideas, particularly in the beginning of the process, there was quite a lot of pushback on the lack of diversity of our group and what that meant in terms of racial capitalism and our ability as a group to talk about 2030. This was something that really struck me personally as someone who helped organize this group. So I got to thinking of, well, how can we change that? And as all this was happening, part of, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement that really exploded in 2020 in the US started moving into seriously considering changing mascots, particularly in sports teams, but also in the university that I went to, George Washington University. And so I got to thinking, well, what if my high school changed its mascot from the colonials to the decolonials? What would that look like? And I thought this would be a really, really fascinating way to kind of take this stories from the future idea in a bit of an unexpected direction, but also it would be a really great way for me to pick Alex's brain, because this is something that I've been interested in, thinking more about decolonial thought, anti-racist thought, but it's something that in my role as a sustainability geek, I hadn't really read or thought that much about. So I pulled her in and I said, hey, Alex, do you want to work with me on this? And fortunately, she said yes. So she's going to share a little bit more about the context and what we started doing together.
And for me, I was excited to have the opportunity to do something a little more creative. I've been really interested in thinking about how we bring storytelling and fiction and speculation to these very difficult conversations and spaces. And so this was a great opportunity to bring some whimsy and some fun and some creativity to something that we don't tend to associate with any one of those things whatsoever. So just a little bit of context, like Lisa mentioned, we both went to Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. It was a magnet school in Virginia in the United States, right outside of Washington, D.C., consistently ranks one of the highest in the United States for achievement, and also just a very fraught place because of questions with its admission standards, because of who does and doesn't get the benefit of that quality of an education and the experiences that persons of color and others had in that environment that was not very welcoming for them. And that's juxtaposed with, I think, the generally positive memories that I had and I think Lisa had as well. And so how those two coexist is an interesting question. And as Lisa mentioned, at the same point in time, seeing all of these conversations and discussions happening around changing mascots, building on a lot of work that had been done in Indigenous communities for a long time. And for example, finally seeing success in getting rid of the moniker Redskins for the Washington football team. And so we wanted to imagine what it would look like if TJ did that in the same way that GW had begun to do. And so we reached out first to the school, reached out to teachers to see if maybe teachers or students would want to help. We got a very gentle and kind note that essentially said no and just thanked us for still caring as alumni. And so then we reached out to our network of friends and alumni to see if they were interested and to see if they knew of any other alumni that might be interested in engaging in this creative endeavor. We ended up with 5 alumni from the classes of 1999, which is when Lisa and I graduated high school, and 2000. And also worked with Caitlin, who's part of the Stories from the Future effort here. And I'll let Lisa talk about the artifacts.
Sure. So I put this up just so we can see a bit of who's on the team. And I especially love this screenshot of our first and I think biggest artifact, because you can see Caitlin really went the extra mile with the glasses for a little bit of a costume for her character. And that was the biggest artifact that we did. Is we imagined, okay, if TJ changes its mascot from the colonials to the decolonials, there are going to be a lot of meetings with administrators, with alumni, with parents, with students, imagining how to implement that new mascot. So the 6 of us met on Zoom several times and we discussed, okay, well, we want to have a meeting that's based on a homecoming float and sharing this mascot on the homecoming float, but then also just the fun of administration. And maybe this is also because Alex and I both got masters in public administration, that we love this kind of the nitty-gritty of how do you actually implement a huge change like this. So this was a really fun exercise for us because it was really at its core an improvisation exercise where each of us played a character that was it was a true character. So we each played a character who was putting forth arguments that were real to us, but where we could share kind of different aspects and questions, maybe even concerns about changing this mascot. What would it look like? What would it mean? How would we share it within the TJ community? Just a quick word about the 2 other, the two other artifacts that we shared before we go more into the video meeting. We also created a syllabus. So at TJ, all freshmen take an integrated biology, English, and technology 3-block class. It's called IBET, and this is kind of really iconic to TJ alumni. So we imagined, what would it look like if we decolonized that IBET? So we worked together, because several of us in the group are teachers, to imagine, okay, well, what would the units look like? And what could we learn? And then this was also very tricky for us, because we imagined, well, a decolonized IBET, what if TJ itself needs to disappear as an elite school? Is this idea of education even in keeping with decolonial thought? So that was all very interesting, but the cornerstone of a lot of our work, especially in the Zoom meeting, and I'm going to see if I can make this work properly now, was the mascot itself. So one of our team members, Jason, is an expert coder, and he agreed to make an animated digital mascot. We also thought, as a science and technology school, why not, right? Why not code a digital mascot? Which is, it just felt so fitting to us. So I'm going to try to run this. Let's see if this works here, because this is one of the very cornerstones of the artifacts that we created together. So you can see here, this is also available on the website. You can link to this. This is CodePen, which is a public way to share different code. And let's see here. So what you can see first is the torus, which is our mascot, and the new mascot. And it starts that it's all white, which represents settler colonists. And as it runs, that white is replaced by blue. And both white and blue are TJ's colors. As you can imagine, with the colonials, they're red, white, and blue. Let's try to run it again. And it's, okay, I'm going to try one more time. Does it want to run? Okay, and as it runs, you can see this blue replacing the white, and the blue represents indigenous spaces, which take over the white settler colonist space until eventually the torus disappears. And this was also a very interesting moment in our live meeting. So this is something that we wanted to share with you kind of as a dramatic reading. And here, Alex and Caitlin are going to help me by reading some of the roles from the meeting. So we have here, Caitlin is Josh, Alex is Jason, and I'm going to be myself, if I can manage that. If you could unmute yourself, and let's go. Caitlin, you're first.
That's the mascot.
And then this is amazing and genius and so inspiring. Thank you for all your work on this, Jason.
I can't really tell if I'm offended or amazed that while the whiteness is being erased and the indigenous color is coming, it all disappears. So what is that implying? That decolonization is a mishmash where everything just gets homogenized? I don't know.
Josh, I think that's a great question. My view, and I'm not as steeped in the material as Lisa is, but my view is that it's not so much that it all gets homogenized, so much as the entire property structure, land, resources, etc. The white colonial settlers and pretty much all the rest of us, as we currently still use those resources, that needs to go. The concepts that we brought to bear here were not here before. So white property ownership needs to go, as well as the idea that these things, these resources, are property to be owned by us in the first place. So it all needs to go. Or at least that's me, having popped in here, just starting to look into this idea and still wrestling with this myself, because I do have a strong heart for TJ and don't necessarily want.
And then Josh?
It's interesting. It's interesting trying to hold on to our personal history while also still decolonizing it, which is what happens to the history TJ created for itself. Was the well poisoned to begin with, or are we exempt from our forefathers' mistakes in history we all share?
And then I say, I should probably jump in here as well. This is something we've been discussing in faculty meetings, the idea of the decolonial's mascot as a temporary mascot. That in a utopian world, the idea of decolonial is such an historical concept that at some point it's not meaningful anymore. So what we're hoping is to work toward this with active decolonial stance toward building a world, or at least a TJ community, where the concept decolonial becomes something that's completely descriptive of the past. And then, what our principal at least is hoping, that we can come up with a new mascot that is positive. That once we've eliminated the tourist mascot, we can create something positive together. But first we have to work to clear away all this debris. And I wanted to just share this snippet because this was, to me, a very powerful moment in our improvisation that came about from us working together and thinking together within the context of this speculation. That from Josh saying, wow, I can't imagine that this mascot disappears, I thought, well, wouldn't that be interesting if it disappears? Yeah, at some point we've solved the problem perhaps, right? We don't know what that means right now, but in that future, then we can create a new positive mascot that's working towards our next goal. And we then, in the context of the improvisation, imagined handing off the mascot to a next school that needs to decolonize, that we would hand them the mascot and our syllabus and teaching materials, and we would share with them kind of what we had learned. So I think for me, one of the prompts was, what do you hope others learn from the artifacts? And I think for me, I realized how much I learned from creating the artifacts. So I think it was the process of speculating itself really began creating this future that we were imagining.
And for me, it was really enjoyable and also interesting to see how the creation of the idea sort of happened at the same time that a real discussion happened. And so it was that juxtaposition of improvisation with real discussion that played out in real time with, at times, some of us participating, trying not to smile or laugh or come out of character, and at other times really just fully engaged in the discussion and living in it. And I think it speaks to how storytelling and improv can allow us to get deeper into some of these issues. And I'm really just, sad we can't see what the next Zoom meeting would have held.
And I think we all really enjoyed working together and are thinking about ways to move this forward. But I know we're way over our 10-minute slot, so thanks for sticking with us. I hope that it was interesting for you. We definitely learned a lot. And next, I'm very excited to introduce Mako. I hope that Mako the owl by your window has stopped singing, although I feel sad to say that because I know that was the reason that you muted yourself. So please, we're excited to hear about your artifact.
Yes, it stopped singing. It only actually does that when I'm on a call. It's almost like it senses that I need quiet, and it's like, I'm gonna fill this quiet space and just like be very loud outside your window. So my artifact, is rain. So I'm gonna talk about what led me to that decision to make like rain my artifact, and the form that I decided to take it in. So I live in Harare, Zimbabwe. I've lived in Zimbabwe most of my life. And I went to school at Rhodes University in Makanda, South Africa. And those two details are very important because when I was at university, and I'd say the last 10 years of like being at home, there's been an increasingly urgent water crisis. So at first it was, the rains aren't as stable as they used to be. Either they'd come too early or sorry, they would start too late. If they did come, they would come with a force that nobody expected and they'd cause a lot of damage. And at first people thought, oh, this is unusual. We occasionally have floods, we occasionally have droughts, but this is an abnormality in the pattern. But as the droughts and the floods continued year after year, there was this realization that this is in effect a new normal. The water cycle that we were all used to and that we'd all built our lives around, economically, socially, and culturally, were completely disrupted. And a lot of people obviously suffered as a consequence, not just in terms of, small towns and communities, which are often the first areas or the first places where climate breakdown are experienced, but big cities as well. One of the biggest cities in Zimbabwe came very close. 48-hour water cuts were implemented in an effort to maintain a certain level of water in our national dams. Here in Harare, they would also just sporadically cut off water supplies if demand came too high and the water levels in the dams weren't enough. So actually, received the invitation to be part of Stories from the Future. It was smack bang in the middle of a heat wave. It was really hot and it wasn't raining, and we were told the rain would come, but the skies were completely clear. On the other hand, when I was at school at Rhodes University, Makanda is like a small town, which is like an hour away from the closest city. So it is isolated. And it had been in a water crisis for decades, like on and off for decades. When I was at school, the water crisis was really coming to a head, not just in terms of a change in the climate because it wasn't raining, but also just down to inefficiency. Government was just not responding fast enough. There were breakdowns in terms of supply chains for refurbishing water pipes and cleaning up the dam. And so I'm in this residence at university with I think 100 other girls, and we would have to like fetch water sometimes to take a bath. There would be no water to do the dishes in the dining hall. So at one point it very much became like a health risk. Unfortunately for us, because we were university students and it's essentially a university town, we were prioritized over everyone else. And it was great for us because, we could finally shower and we didn't have to worry about not going without water. But it was also very uncomfortable for me to know I'm only accessing this water because in terms of economic structures in the city, I'm more important than poorer residents or people in poorer areas of Grahamstown who hadn't had water for years. So my personal relationship with water is something I'd been exploring for a while. So when it came time to decide on an artifact, it was almost like an aha moment, because if there's one thing that I would want to bring back from 2030 as a sign of saying, we've all come collectively together and addressed this issue, and we've maybe not completely reversed climate change, but we're on the way to stabilizing it, would be water, because it's something to me that just highlights and symbolizes the natural rhythms of seasons that I've been used to my whole life. And when those natural rhythms were disrupted, it made me very uncomfortable, and it made me feel like I had no control over what the future held. So that was questions 1 and 2, I think. So the last question, in terms of what do I want other people to take from this, or take from this artifact, is really just we treat a lot of natural resources as infinite because they've always been there. So water has always been there. Plants have always been there. Trees have always been there. And even though we are told that we need to have better management of our natural resources, there's also this expectation that, but we're not going to run out of water. We're not going to run out of trees because they've always been there. And what I'd want people to take from this is not to take those resources for granted. There is a very strong possibility that if, Zimbabwe doesn't get better in terms of water management, if we don't address the ways in which we pollute our rivers and our water systems, there is a very strong possibility that as a country, not even like as a city or a town, as a country, we could run out of water. And that's something that I'd want people to take from that. That it's both like a macro responsibility in terms of, governments and organizations and companies need to get involved in terms of changing the way we look at natural resources, implementing policies that protect them, but also on a micro level in terms of individuals. I've had to question how I use water because when I look at it, I was like, I've been very reckless with the way that I've just used water. Like I've just turned on taps and made them run for minutes until the water got hot enough for me to use. And looking at my own actions has made me really appreciate the things that I've taken for granted a lot. So yeah, that is my artifact. I made a little like raindrop in the shape of text, only because text is the medium that I'm most comfortable with. And at first I thought, oh, let me take a photo of rainwater, because it did rain. It did start raining happily. It actually rained this morning again. But I also wanted to make it a bit more personal and just really highlight my personal connection to rain as well.
Thank you. That's amazing. I really appreciated the background to that, specifically, and I think two things in part, we don't, again, take into consideration how these things like water, plants, sunlight may not always be there, at least in the same capacity. But I also really appreciated your sort of aha realization moment that you're only able to access showers and water in some ways because of your economic relationship to your city, right? And I think that that's something that people definitely do not think about as much, right? People aren't critical of that, or at least self-aware. So that's amazing. I appreciate that sort of background and your artifact. So thank you. Just to sort of flag the folks who are tuned into the live stream, at the end of our sort of presentations, we're going to have a conversation, sort of more of a reflection. So we'll have more time to learn and hear from each other's stories as well, because this has been a really generative thing to hear people's processes. I think this is the first time we've really talked about it, actually. So I'm really enjoying this. So with that being said, I think this is a really perfect segue to a project called Future Diaries that a few folks have been working on in this group. And I'm going to let Mike, Antonis, and Caitlin take it from here. Yeah, go for it.
All right, thanks, Dylan. I'm going to start by playing the trailer to our podcast. So give me just a second and I will get that going. Hi, I'm Mike, and I'm from the year 2183 in the Alpha Theta Epsilon 1.5 family of timelines.
I'm Antonis, and I'm from the Tau Omicron Epsilon X2 universe. Mike and I are gliders, a type of intertemporal and multiversal communication specialist.
Ever since we met in glider school, we've been communicating with people in different timelines and universes, connecting the dots between pasts, presents, and futures. That's also how we met Caitlin.
That's me. I'm from 2030. Mike and Antonis helped me tell my story, and I stuck around for the adventure and to help tell yours.
Join us for the Future Diaries podcast, where we talk to people across space and time about their lives.
Some of them might even be from your universe.
We'll talk to you
in the future.
All right. So this was a trailer of our podcast. maybe we should start by just discussing what's behind it. So, Mike, from the Stories from the Future, the original prompt we had was to bring back an artifact from 2030. How would you describe our thought process for creating this artifact?
The podcast idea actually went through several iterations. It started as a news and policy podcast set in what we thought was likely to be 2030 in our universe. But an early draft of the first episode revealed just how dry such a concept could be, and it didn't feel like it had much promise for connecting with listeners on a personal note. As we started talking to each other and other members of the Stories from the Future creative group and the Camp Collapse Collective, we thought it would make more sense to develop a podcast that allowed for discussing many different futures and many different interpretations of the present. From there, we got started with what was essentially a multi-world building exercise, and the podcast idea evolved further still. We're happy with where it has landed. When we began this workshop, we did so with the explicit goal of carbon neutrality by 2030 in mind. So, Antonis, do you think that this factors into our final artifact?
Well, I would say that it does, but in a very limited capacity. Our first podcast episode does, in fact, involve a story from 2030, but this is only one of possible universes 2030. So since our podcast is speculative fiction that is set in a multiverse of possible futures, we think there are many different ways 2030 could turn out. Some of those may include reaching the goal of carbon neutrality, some may not, and for others, this may not even make sense, as they've evolved through different challenges and different ways to interact with our natural environment. So the way that those different futures play out in this multiverse will determine whether carbon neutrality for them has been a necessary step on their path in history, a step that has been taken way too late, or not even a necessity for them. I guess it depends a lot on what we learn from how our present unveils itself. So with that being said, Mike, what would you say we hope our audience will take away or learn from this artifact?
Our hope is that the podcast will inspire listeners to think about the wide range of possible futures from their perspectives and work to make their presents and futures better. Given how tough things are right now in the world for so many people, with a global pandemic, systemic racism, high levels of income and wealth inequality, authoritarianism on the rise, and of course, as if those weren't enough, climate change, there are plenty of reasons for outrage, negativity, and pessimism. And these feelings are only natural, and they are justified given the circumstances. But our hope is that our podcast can also create space for hope, positivity, and optimism, not because it always covers cheery stories, which it won't. Indeed, many of the stories we'll talk about on the podcast are of people in different circumstances and dark times. But while we believe the dark visions can provide impetus for change, we're also convinced that if we cannot even imagine better presents and futures, we will have a very hard time making them happen. So we plan to cover both, and we hope the universal wisdom we can glean from many types of stories and possible futures can be a benefit to all. But why did we choose to use podcasts as a format for our artifact, Antonis?
Well, we chose to create a podcast because it just felt relevant to the way people consume information in our present. It's just that podcasts are immensely popular in 2030. It's also a format that we were already intrigued ourselves to explore. So we wanted to express ourselves through speculative fiction because it felt natural in relation to looking back from a possible future, which was the original aim of the Stories from the Future project. And even more so as we've expanded that so far as we've reached to this multiverse of different possible futures and presents. We also wanted to start something that would continue to grow beyond the Stories from the Future creative group and project, and something that could inspire listeners to engage with the show and take action. So this is why our plan is to feature listeners as guests in future episodes and the stories to be featured in the show. We hope that this process of thinking about the future will help to inspire action and change. In the end, I could say that our podcast is just like human connection. It transcends time and space. So, well, this is all about Future Diary. Oh, wait. I just received an intertemporal message that the first episode has been launched in this universe. Wow. So go to futurediaries.show and we'll talk to you
in the future.
Oh, wow. Thank you guys so much. That was a lightness that I really appreciate. It's been very emotional and I've appreciated that too, but it was nice to change wavelengths and maybe timelines. I don't know, alternate universes. I'm still getting up to speed on all of this myself. So we have, last but not least, a final presentation that I'm especially excited for from Malit, because she has had, I think, maybe the trickiest time of everybody in Stories from the Future. We've already seen an amazing diversity of artifacts, from written to audiovisual to physical and everything in between. But Malit, from the beginning, she came with a very clear idea of what she wanted to do, and somehow didn't get the level of enthusiasm from everyone else, but still managed to find other interested people. And I still want to, well, you're going to explain in a minute, but I still want to participate with you on this as well. And so that's why I'm very excited that Malit can share her experience of working through Zoom with the body in her artifact. So take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lisa. Yeah, let me just quickly prepare my screen share here. Hopefully it's gonna work. Yes, this. So as Lisa already mentioned, oh well, if I click this, is it gonna work? No, whatever. I'll just leave it like that. Yeah, as Lisa mentioned, my artifact, no, damn it, is a collaborative movement exploration online, because we are obviously in a pandemic, and we cannot just meet with each other and dance with each other or move with each other in any space. And yeah, so what is behind the idea? What has this to do with the future? I myself, about 2 years ago, I discovered through some basic movement explorations with other people, so not dancers, like not professional dancers, just like people with bodies, how we communicated through our bodies in a big group without saying any words, and how we just by observing each other, tuning in with ourselves and sensing what impulse comes, bringing this to the group, and the group transformed it and bring it back to me. And there was it was something so so powerful to me that I was like, this power of our bodies is something that I believe in, is crucial for making change in for the future. So but as we are in a time where our bodies are also potentially threatening to everybody around us, I mean, our bodies are carriers of viruses these days, so everything around the body is also very forbidden, so to say. I was like, okay, I still believe in this potential to be able to connect with each other through the body, but we need to use Zoom. So I try to find mostly for the first, so this process is like a first step for me to explore this further and see if this works. So I kind of hooked up some friends to try this out. So we met online, and I played a bit of first get some made some warm-up exercises to tune in the body, and then I gave clues of like, if you could write a diary entry about the next months, what would that look like? So we were just basically writing something into the air, into the space around us, that you can see here on the screenshot from the video. And first everybody was doing it on their own. just so not looking at the camera. And then in the next step, I asked everybody, so let's write a collective poem, basically, where we would look at what is the other doing, like movement, yeah, like and so I continue that process, going a little bit away from writing in particular something with a hand, but more writing with like impulses that come from areas in the body that we maybe don't think of because we don't, yeah, like it's maybe the lower back that is achy, or I don't know, shoulder because we had an injury at some point, or some other parts that are maybe even neglected because of some trauma. So I wanted to, or I told my participants to connect to these places and improvise from there, something that yeah, like what does this area want to do? And as you can see on the next screenshot, we were all somehow really like tuning in. So like, okay, where is the spot right now? And my aim was we can only reach out to others if we first tune in with ourselves. So like what's going on inside myself, and the better I know that, the easier it will be then afterwards to reach out and to send signals and receive signals, if that's yeah. And then so in the last step, I really did emphasize the fact that, okay, right now we want to just move freely, so not think of a specific spot, but kind of, yeah, also this what Robin said, like improvise a little bit each other. So this whole thing was a bit like one person does a movement, and then the other is like, I can do it the same way, I don't have to, but what can I take from that and make it a little bit my own? And what from that movement speaks to me that I like to feel how it, the shape or the quality. And so the artifact in the end is 8 minutes now, to cut out a little bit. And for me, it was exciting to see, is this just like a funny idea that I have, and it's rather simple, but maybe it really does something, especially because everything is online. And so I did a few individual sessions with friends to see if there's anything interesting that moves them inside and that makes them really feel connected. And everybody confirmed that, well, after these sessions, I feel like that's the first time kind of on Zoom that I feel like I'm not like leaving Zoom and I still feel like on the other side. I actually feel like I went a bit through the screen and I could connect. And I yeah, and I see this for us as for the future, a huge transformative potential to make use of. We can zoom in and we can reach out, even though we are not physically in the same space. And this is what I would like to like, what I would like others to consider, at least from this artifact, to acknowledge the body and how it is not only particularly fragile in these times of a pandemic, but powerful when there's not a pandemic. Yeah, and I think that's all I wanted to share with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Again, just by all means, check out the website. You'll see lots of these artifacts kind of posted there. And there you can actually see videos, right? We've been careful not to share too many technical things. Again, videos much beyond a few stills, just because on Zoom, again, things sort of slow down. So if you want to see the full effect of these things, by all means, check it out. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to sort of transition to this group reflective space to just sort of digest. Again, I mentioned that for me, at least, this is kind of the first time we've kind of heard from one another about process. I think our meetings have a lot of the times been about, well, what are you doing? How's it coming? But not necessarily about that internal process. And I think this has been a really interesting, enlightening presentation, I guess, for me as well. I certainly have lots of things to share. I think Marit's conversation is a really important one to think about. You know, when we think about storytelling, what gets lost? As someone who studies storytelling myself, I know that there's a lot to be said about the in-person aspect, right? The presence of people with one another, eye contact, body language, etc. And how do you communicate that through Zoom has been really tricky for me, and I'm sure others. So I think that's a really good transition to think about, again, this larger conversation of process and what people have learned. So just so that we're all on the same page, folks who are you know, tuning in, we have 3 questions, and we'll sort of go through each one and spend a few minutes, and everyone can sort of tune in or speak to whichever question they feel led to speak to. But basically, we're asking, you know, what was your favorite part of this process? What worked well for you, and what did you learn? Also, what was difficult in this process? What did not work well? And what would you change or do differently if you could go back and redo these 8 months with the knowledge you have now of Zoom storytelling? And then finally, what did you learn about this process that you want to carry with you sort of moving forward, right? If that's continuing your project, right? If again, for the example, the podcast, Stories from the Future, Future Diaries, clearly they're trying to continue that into the future. But if it's more of an impression or an idea or a feeling that you want to carry with you, that would be welcome to hear from. So we'll start with the first question. You know, what was your favorite part of the process? What worked well for you, and what did you learn? And again, whoever, whenever can chime in there. Again, I certainly have lots of things to say, but you've heard a lot from me already.
Or maybe I can, oh, sorry, Franziska, go for it.
What worked well for me was you organizers always kept us on the ball and gave us deadlines, which helped us to actually get stuff done, I think. And it took a while, but after a few meetings, you really get to know the people in the meetings, and you look forward to meeting them again. And yeah, you become friends with them, even though you've never met them in real life.
Yeah, I want to second that. I was thinking, I think it was you, Malit, you sent me an email a month or 2 ago that was, you know, about sending me a link or responding to whatever I'd said. And then at the end you said, yeah, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in person at some point. And I thought that's a really weird statement, because obviously we know each other, we've met. And then I realized I haven't met any of you in person. And it was like, I hadn't even thought about that, because it seemed so obvious. Like, I've seen you, all of you, more often than my real, you know, in real life friends the last few months, you know? So that's, yeah, definitely true. And maybe for me, as someone who helped, you know, facilitate this process, my favorite part was really you all taking up and taking advantage of the openness of the process to really create artifacts that run the gamut, and artifacts that I could not explain to people, that you have to explain to people, because you're really the experts on that type of artifact. That we didn't all just do short stories or just do poems, or that we all did different things. So that was really, really exciting to me.
I have something to share, which is just that I think we can all agree, folks on the live stream as well, that this is maybe one of the most globally stressful years in a long time. And doing something that is artistic and creative and positive. You know, I know Antonis was saying, like, of course, some of our thoughts go to the negative, and Mike was saying this as well. You know, we're sort of in a negative time period, potentially, depending on how your life is going. But to kind of project to the future and imagine and create something that's positive was just, it was like a breath of fresh air when I would get to work on it. So that was extremely, really, really good. That was a really good part of this whole thing. So thank you.
If I could add something, I suppose, again, I've been talking a lot, so someone else please chime in. But what I really liked, and I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit, but I'll try to return to this when we get to that second question. But what's been both really interesting but also difficult has been the sort of wholesale migration to Zoom. And so I'll stick on the positive for starters. You know, it was interesting back in April or so when it was still novel and I could see lots of my friends who were DJs or whatever all over the world, and I could tune in from my couch. And I remember having several Saturdays of, wow, this is kind of cool. Like I wouldn't be able to see this otherwise. And that was around the same time period that this group, you know, we started talking, I guess, more concertedly over the summer. So some of the novelty of Zoom had certainly worn off, right? It was less exciting, more exhausting to have to watch my friends on Zoom. But that being said, as someone who studies culture and sort of cultural politics, I find that how the way Zoom constrains the way we socialize and reformats it has been a really sort of in the abstract exciting process to see how people have persevered regardless of sort of the exhaustion of it. And I think a big part of that has been why this group has been you know, successful and why we have so many different perspectives, because we've had to really reformat and think about what we would be doing. And I can't help but think, you know, if we were able to meet in person, what these artifacts may look like, you know, and they might be more similar, right? Because of the way people wear off on one another, we might have all written stories or done podcasts, et cetera. But because we're also together, but in our own small, weird little worlds, we've had to be creative differently. And I think that that's just a testament to Zoom storytelling in general. And it's been a really frustrating but exciting thing to learn about myself even through this process. So yeah, I've really enjoyed Zoom, but again, I will reserve my comments for how much I have not enjoyed it for the second part.
I think one of the things I appreciated most about the group was its diversity, which is very important because at the beginning, as Lisa briefly mentioned, we had this very big discussion on people, groups that were being represented in this group, and what the organizers decided to do is to stick with the group we had and kind of explore all the diversity which was already at play with us people who signed up for the workshop. And I mean, we ended up having a really wide variety of media explored, of universes, storylines, and the question of diversity also came up again in its linguistic component. So at some point, we had the discussion on the hegemonic role of English, that is the language we use to exchange, that everyone used to create their artifacts in these workshops, in the artifacts that used words. And for example, what we did with the Faces and Places group was also trying to tell stories with images or videos, not necessarily with words, not necessarily in English. And I think one of my favorite artifacts we produced is a very short list of words in Esperanto, which is an idea that came up when we thought, hey, we're going beyond nation states, we're going beyond the carbon economy and racial capitalism. We don't necessarily need national languages to communicate with each other, not just you know, French, English, Spanish, but also, I mean, not even natural languages. Esperanto is a completely artificial language that, you know, is maybe worth re-exploring in some ways for the future. So I thank you all once more for the diversity and the richness and the generosity.
I'd like to take up on that because I really feel the same vibe when it comes to diversity, and I think it's worth repeating many times again that diversity brings power and elevates the result of whatever it is you can come up with as an original creation. I've felt it along many years in my involvement in international youth work, and through this project, I felt it in practice through just the three people behind the Future Dyers project. how the diversity of just 3 people being given the ground to develop their ideas and interconnect with each other, and prove in practice that human connection really has power is, yeah, it's just incredible. So for me, the favorite part of our creative process was the fact that we were so openly interjecting and co-developing our ideas.
Maybe to piggyback off of that, I feel like what you're all hinting at is something that I, for some reason, hadn't put in these terms yet, but now I'm thinking on these levels. And I think diversity, yes, but I think what really made this group work so well was the horizontality of it, that I felt like we all felt equally empowered to make statements, to ask questions, to bring in our expertise, that it wasn't a sense of there's a hierarchy of some people are the experts and the other people are learning or doing what the experts are saying. And I really cherished that in this group. I mean, the fact that we started with, unfortunately, some people who are not here anymore kind of asking us as organizers, hey, did you organize this group the right way? And really questioning our methods in a way that stuck with me enough that it really strongly informed the artifacts that we created. I think that made the process transformative in a way that it wouldn't have been, I think, if we hadn't kind of seen each other as equals to the extent that we did.
All right, so maybe we can transition to that second question. And if you have still feelings about the first question, by all means, share them. But the second question, again, is what was a difficult part of this process? What did not work well? And what would you change differently? Again, with the knowledge you have now, almost a year into this global pandemic, for example, after 8 months of working together. Yeah, so again, what would you change, if you would?
Okay, for me, it's not necessarily something I would change, but I think a difficult part for me was the whole process. Obviously, like I've never done anything like this before. And like a lot of the like speculative thinking and reimagining that I've done in previous like spaces, it's been very academic. So trying to like get out of that purely academic mind was very difficult for me. Like I wanted to like theorize everything and dress everything up in academic language. So embracing that creative side was a bit difficult for me at first. Not just with the first presentation, but even with my artifact. But I think it was difficult in a good way. I don't know if that makes sense, because it was difficult because it took me out of my comfort zone and it challenged me to rethink the way that I think about things. And also just in terms of like presenting and engaging with other people's work as well. So for me, it's not something I would change, but it was definitely something I had to overcome or work through.
Yeah, I'd like to echo, I guess, what Mako is saying, which is that the early versions of the kind of what I was saying earlier in our presentation, the early versions of the podcast, I kind of fell back into, environmental policy wonk mode, and it's just not a way to communicate, I guess, right? It's not a way to connect with people. And so I thought like this really pushed me towards thinking about storytelling and about communication in a way that involves personal human connection, and thinking about stories as a way to connect with people in a way that they can feel, and in a way that I think that's much more effective at influencing people. I feel a lot more motivated to change when I feel like there's a connection when I relate to somebody, rather than when I just have I don't know, well. So again, just to echo what Mako was saying, I just wanted to make it all academic, and that doesn't seem very helpful. So I've really liked the way that this has pushed me to think differently and to create something to connect with people in a more human way.
So nice you're saying that, because that's exactly what I was also after, in my artifact. For me, not sure if I would be able to change that, because it's more personal learning that I realize when we started. The pandemic was on like 4 months, 5 months or something like that. So this working remotely, communicating remotely, doing everything on Zoom was at the time, I mean, we started to get used to it, but there was still a lot more in the back of my head. Maybe this can also, just be done in a more offline way also. Or there was something inside me, just like in impulse, that I was like, it's so much easier if, and by now I don't question that anymore, that that's the way it works now. It's and I start, so what I mean is, I feel like I'm starting to lose references to what it was like before. So and I'm like, okay, that's the way it goes now. And now also with having created something, it has its own, it stands on its own. It's a different experience, but it's a lot more present. And so what I want to say is, I feel like if we had started now, I would feel less barriers inside myself to create something in this way than half a year ago. But that's not about the project as such, as more personal learning experience, I would say.
I wanted to say something, which is that there was sort of a questioning of the, diversity issue in the beginning. And I definitely think, and we talked about a few ways to sort of tackle that in the future. I'm glad you guys didn't just scrap the whole project. I'm glad that we went through with it, and I think we learned a lot. And I think just in the future, it might be good to just build on what we've done here, and maybe like reach out to more, because there is an incredible diversity in this group alone in terms of languages and countries and ideas and the artifacts themselves. But I do think that, it does kind of represent mostly a Western, like advanced capitalistic kind of viewpoint. And so to have more diversity in terms of that type of viewpoint, I think would be really valuable, especially when thinking 10 years into the future as to what's possible. So that would be one area that I would love to, help in the next round to create.
Yeah, and if I could maybe just jump on there again very quickly, so as to not take up too much time. It's interesting, you mentioned, Mari, how it's hard to even think about life before to some extent. It's like when someone gets a new haircut, at first you're like, ew, but then eventually you're just like, I guess that's just how they look. And you can't really think about them otherwise. I feel like, this wholesale migration to Zoom is sort of like that, right? I think we can, of course, imagine what it's like to go to bars or whatever. But when I walk around my downtown with my dog at night and I see people at a bar, I'm like, oh my God, like it's scary. In any case, I think this conversation of diversity has been really key to our process in some ways. I think it was difficult, of course, at first. And for folks who may be tuning in, who are part of the conversation, I appreciate it, like Lisa was saying, so much, because it really forced us to reckon with the fact that in light of everything else that was going on and being reckoned with, something as simple as just sending out a call for participants to a listserv, which is mundane, it's something I do often, really replicates this process of, hierarchies of who can access things like this. I sent it to my listservs, my professional listservs, but as an academic geographer, right, that's largely to Western academic, mostly white people. And something as simple as that really was put into perspective as, that's not a good way to access the diversity of stories and experiences on this planet. And so we did persevere through that process, I think, and I think it went okay, and I appreciate and love what we have come up with, but I wish that even then I could have had that foresight, right? And of course, I think about these things in an academic way. I've been a part of these conversations at academic institutions, but despite that, I just did the same thing again, right? Sending it to listservs. And I think this really forces us to think about what Antonis was saying, of course, more diversity, more experiences, better stories. And as we collectively think about the future, that's so critical, right? And something we constantly ask ourselves is, who are we to even think about the future? You know, in the United States, for example, there's folks who were largely over the summer, but still are protesting for their lives to matter in general in the present. And therefore, maybe it's difficult to even think about the future for so many people. So thinking about the future in and of itself is a privilege. So all of that to say, it's been a journey in that sense as well. I appreciate what we've come up with, and I think it's certainly been a process of learning. Just really quickly, the difficulties of Zoom I wanted to mention. As an organizer of Zoom content at this point, it's been, again, as seeing a positive, the constraining of Zoom has sort of forced innovation in a lot of ways, but that straining was really difficult. And I think in addition to this, teaching online, socializing online or not socializing online. So for example, I tried to have Thanksgiving with my mom and she was like, no. But I would have loved to have seen my mom. You know, it's been certainly almost like doing double work, but I think again, in a cultural sense, everyone just has a new haircut. And at this point, it's kind of like, okay, well, this is what we're doing now for the foreseeable however long. And I appreciate that this group has sort of made me come to terms with that.
I just got a text from Alessandra. She said one of her favorite things, to go back to the last question, was making a physical thing. And I think she was specifically referring to the quilt that Kristen, unfortunately, is not here today. She was going to present her quilt artifact. I don't know, maybe she overslept again. I know with Alaska, she's had some problems with the time zone. Maybe that's a difficulty too, or a challenge. So I just wanted to say that. And then maybe also for me, one of the most difficult things, and there were a lot of challenges. I mean, I could go probably for 10 minutes of listing just the difficult things that I faced. But one that hasn't been mentioned at all that I just wanted to quickly say, a difficulty for me was being a mother of a 3-year-old, particularly having these meetings on the weekend when my son is almost certainly at home, and here in the winter, he is at home in the next room playing Lego. So that's really been a challenge. He came in at our decolonials meeting, and he came in, I think, at our last internal meeting and insisted on sitting on my lap and working with Mama. So maybe a shout out to my husband, and for those of you who are also parents, to the other caregivers in our group who are doing really amazing work that doesn't really get enough credit. So thank you, Andle. I don't know if you're going to listen to this later. He's definitely not on the live stream, but yeah, thank you very much for taking care of our kid for so many hours on so many weekends the last few months.
All right, well, it seems like we have about 10 minutes left to the live stream, and I'll just move on to that third question of, you know, what did you learn from this process, and what will you carry kind of after our program ends, at least this version of it. And again, if you have sort of percolated and have thoughts about those first two questions, by all means share them. But we have about 10 minutes left to sort of wrap up this conversation and in this live stream. And then of course we'll internally meet again after that, so don't go away. But yeah, so what did you learn about this process that you'll carry with you?
For me, this was my first foray into attempting anything like speculative fiction. I don't know, I'm not a huge consumer of fiction historically, somewhat, but I just tend to read a lot more nonfiction. And this really forced me, I think, in a good way, to engage with speculative fiction in a much more useful way. So that's something I think I'll always take with me, is just how rewarding that is, but also how good that can be for communicating ideas, even things maybe that you learn about through more nonfiction methods.
This seems like this is the hardest question because no one's jumping in. So maybe I will. I think maybe to piggyback on what a couple people have said about kind of in the challenge area, I think Mako and Mike, you were pointing out this, that it was hard to get into the speculation. I think this is an area that I've been interested in for a while. And I think part of the reason I was so excited to work on this project. And I think one of the things I've learned is I'm not as good at speculating as I thought I was. And also, I think once you start going down the route of speculating and speculative fiction, I think this, to what you said a lot, in particular, Mike, that it really does become personal. And then you are working at a completely different level than, for example, an IPCC report. So you see things like climate change in such a different way that you're using completely different language. And when we came together, one of our, or at least my, impetuses for doing this was to imagine a carbon neutral 2030. And that's something that none of our artifacts talked about in the way that I would think climate scientists and policymakers would want to read about as a to-do list. And that's maybe one of the, I don't want to say limitations of speculative fiction, but that's one of the challenges of speculating is how do you, from going to these personal stories, how do you scale that up to imagine this carbon neutral 2030? Because that's maybe a global thing, or maybe this is an area where as we get better at speculating, we'll be better at translating between these different layers and levels of action. So that's something that's really exciting for me to think about going into the future as I keep speculating, because one of my kind of personal goals this year is to write kind of a speculative story every week of, a part of that carbon neutral future. So yeah, thinking about that, maybe I'll finally get good at speculating at some point.
Yeah, I think the thing I took from this workshop and we'll bring into the future is to think about the future as in a positive way as well, like with climate activism and as a scientist and looking at coral reefs. I often think we often talk about the bad stuff that's going to happen, but almost none of us have actually a vision of the future. And this workshop and other things I did in this half year helped me to actually get a quite clear vision of what I want the future to be, which I didn't have at all before. I know, what kind of, that I want circular economy, that I want people to bike and walk more and to share vehicles, and those vehicles should be electric or non-fossil fuels and all that kind of stuff, which I had no clue about before, because it's actually really complex, these futures we're going to create, because it's transitions in all different parts. It's not just transitioning one part of our society, it's transitioning them all at the same time. So it does take time to think about that internally and as a group of how it will look like. And I definitely want to keep doing that and keep spreading visions of a future rather than just spreading the news of the bad future we may have and what's happening right now with climate change.
And if I could just add a couple of thoughts, I think that that's a perfect way of thinking about what we've been up to. And one thing that I just want to sort of note and continue in my thought process is this idea that the future isn't necessarily a time, right? It's more of a place, which perhaps sounds very academic in one way, but all of that to say, in thinking about whose future is represented, and thinking about the work we've been doing in this group, right? And you think about the future, again, not as something we're headed to, but more in a horizontal sense, the work we're doing right now affects the future, right? So there's not necessarily going to be this transition. It's happening all the time. And I think when we talk about prefiguration, which is this idea that the work we do in the present necessarily affects the future. So when we think about the future, again, not as this thing we're headed towards, whether or not that's going to be positive or negative, it's the collective work we do in the present that necessarily creates that future. And I think storytelling, of course, is a big part of that work. But I think what's been really lovely about this group is, again, this collective practice, which of course has been the overall goal here. I'm thinking about the sort of program that's been funding this work, and collaboratively building these knowledges, and again, thinking about which futures are represented in this group, which stories we're telling, whether that's positive or negative, but also which stories are not present that we've talked about in this diversity question, for example, but that regardless, the work that's being done, through our activism, through our storytelling, through this group, through our writing otherwise, is necessarily forming a future. And I think being mindful of that has been really helpful for me in my writing outside of this group, but also as a part of this group in general. So yeah, it's been a really good reminder to myself that the future isn't something over there or something that's going to happen. It's something that's already happening, right? We're constantly making it in the present.
I just wanted to add one thing to what you guys are all saying, which is, the creating the future aspect of this. I even teach, I'm a professor of geography, and I teach participatory research methods, right? So where you don't just go in sort of a top-down way to like a community and tell them what to do, but you ask the community, well, what needs to be done here, and start from that point instead of starting from this like supposed expert point of view. And what I will really take away from this whole thing is to do that with the future as well. It's remarkable the diversity of thoughts and fictitious futures that came from just this one little group. And if we can constantly be doing that wherever we go, instead of just thinking of yourself as an expert and thinking of yourself in this little box, constantly trying to break down those walls and expand what could be possible. I think that, you see it happening live in these meetings that we've been attending. And I think taking that with us, taking that hope and that possibility and the evidence that we've seen happening here, I think that's what I'll take away for sure.
All right, well, thank you for that. We have about 1 more minute if anyone wants to chime in or have some final thoughts. Maybe from Daniela or Olga, if they have any ideas. They've sort of been in the background facilitating this whole thing, and I don't think they've gotten enough airtime in our meetings. So I want to thank them, especially for all the work that they've done in keeping us organized to organize everyone else. That's been really helpful, and I've really enjoyed working with everyone so far. So yeah, any final thoughts?
Maybe I can jump in here and add my final thoughts to it. I learned really a lot from the whole process. I mean, starting from the things that were mentioned many times now, talking about diversity, how to organize ourselves. I mean, when we started the workshop, it was relatively new to us, the situation. We didn't know how long it would continue, how it would work, whether we would be able to actually keep the group together over such a long period of time. I mean, that was a big experiment, as I said in the beginning, and also kind of like, yeah, a real challenge to find a good balance between, trying to motivate people and keeping up with them or catching up with them, but at the same time not being too pushy and considering that everyone has so much in their heads and on their tables and in their lives at the moment. So I'm extremely happy to see what came out of this and about this group and these amazing people that came together to create such a beautiful exhibition. For everyone watching, I can really only recommend to check it out on the website. Yeah, I can only say a big thank you again to Dylan and Lisa for creating this and keeping the group together and having this and always positive energy and spirit and going forward. It was really amazing and so much fun. I hope we will continue in the future in some way. And talking about the future again, I actually hope we all meet in 10 years in 2030 to see the futures that develop by then and see maybe what came true, what went in unexpected ways. Hopefully a lot of the positive ideas became reality by then. And again, a big thank you also to Olga. And just ending, I would also want to invite everyone to join us for the Collective Practices finale. So this was the kind of final event and exhibition launch for this workshop series. And then next week on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we will have 3 days of wrapping up our program. We will also meet again with Lisa, Dylan, and also Lynn will join us, and we'll talk again about storytelling and speculating about futures, maybe a bit more on a meta level, let's say, not so much related to the single or the individual artifacts now, but more as an experience in general, and about many other things as well. We will be together with participants from the past months that we had in collective practices, and some new ones, and yeah, hopefully have a nice ending of the series that will actually just is to be continued as we see this work. So thanks again, and a nice evening to everyone who was out there watching us.
Thanks also for me. Just before we turn off the live stream, I just want to reiterate the zine is on our website. It has a lot of great artifacts that you saw today, as well as many, many more, including a science fiction corner with short science fiction stories and lots of other things. Also, you can see all of our artifacts on the website as well at collectivepractices.akutmachtneu.de. We hope that you check all of that out. Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening, afternoon, morning, night, wherever you are. And the participants, we're going to hang out for a minute.